மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.
Well, the next game we're going to examine comes from Istanbul in the year 2003, and it's between Del Rio Angelis, playing with the white pieces, and he's playing the English Grandmaster Stuart Conquest. Again, we see the knight coming out to f3, black taking on e5, white recapturing with the knight, and now Miles's flexible move c6. As I said before, there's such a huge range of choice for white in this particular position, and we can only touch upon several of these moves, but in this particular game, Del Rio Angelis develops his bishop out to d3, which is slightly unusual, but of course it can't be that bad. I suppose the only drawback I can see with that move is it does rather encourage black at a certain moment to think about the move knight b4. I'm not so sure. I mean, you can argue about till the cows come home whether bishop e2 or bishop d3 or bishop c4 are better moves. Just going back, it might be worth at this point just running over a few of the other moves that white has in this position. Michael Adams was once tempted in this position with the immediate c4. That move, if it worked, if it drove the knight back, would be actually probably white's best move in this particular position, but I believe that black can take advantage of this unusual circumstance by playing knight b4 here, and that is quite a tricky move for white to meet, because black is immediately threatening queen takes d4, and then if white captures, then knight c2 check. So this makes white's next move a3 unavailable, so white's got to find another way of playing the position. Hence, in the game Adams versus Burkhardt, Michael Adams, this from England, European Team Championship 1996, white played bishop to e3, presumably preparing the move a3. Then black played bishop f5, and already this is slightly embarrassing for white, because he's forced to make a move he doesn't want to make in the light of black's threat of knight c2 check. So knight a3 was played, and now black played knight d7, after which I believe black is well on the road to achieving a satisfactory position. Let's just see how Adams-Burkhardt continued. Adams took on d7, queen takes d7, and in typical Michael style settled for a common sense move, bishop e2. After that, black just carried on with developing g6, and now d5, an attempt to disrupt black's development before bishop g7 and castle happened, followed by rook to d8, after which it would only be white that was in trouble in view of the slightly exposed position of the d pawn. However, black was able to cope quite comfortably with d5 by playing bishop g7. Adams played bishop d4, and then came the cute move knight c2 check, which resolved all problems of the offside knight. And after knight takes c2, bishop takes c2, queen d2, black took on d4 and castled, white castled, c takes d5, c takes, excuse me, slip of the mouse, c takes d5, and now I think queen d6 is probably the most accurate move, with at least equality for black. Now, just taking play back to the position after knight d7, I believe that g4 has also been suggested for white, but there I think bishop e4 is a good probing move, and if white has to play f3, bishop g6, then knight takes g6, h takes g6, queen b3, e6, with quite an interesting position where both sides have mutual weaknesses. And this was the game Duggan versus Madsen, Hastings 2005, a game which black went on to win. The position looks very unclear to me. It's also unclear to me where white's going to put his king. So if we return to c6 now, we can see that playing the immediate c4 is not quite as good as it seems, which is why, of course, white chooses, in general, quieter moves. Now, white can prefer the immediate c3. That's quite uncommon, but of course it's not too bad. Black's presumably got a number of choices against that. He can play his bishop out to f5, he can play knight d7, or he can play, just to suggest another approach, the move g6 here, as was played in the game Sher versus Bagirov, Baku 1996. Just to give you a flavour of what happened in that game, white played g3, black played bishop g7, bishop d2, and again the characteristic offer of the exchange in this variation with knight d7. Sher took on d7, not immediately attractive, but well, what is white to play? I suppose if he can go knight f3, black generally prepares c5 there, or e5. So knight takes d7 was played, bishop takes d7. White's relying on the fact that the pawns on d4 and c3 shut down the diagonal. But, well, black was very, very comfortable after queen c8 and then bishop h3. This is just a nice, easy position for black with equality. Returning to the position after c6, there really are quite a number of these sixth move alternatives. h3 is another move, and the idea of this, of course, is to make it as difficult as possible for black to get rid of this bishop. We've seen already that bishop g4 figures in black's plans in a lot of these lines. Well, h3 is a move from Vladimir Jansa from the Czech Republic. Once again, I think knight d7 seems to be quite a reasonable approach. Then knight f3. g6, bishop c4, bishop g7, castles, castles. And then the game Jansa versus Burkar, France 1999, continued rook e1. Pawn up to e6. Bishop to b3, pawn to b5. Bishop comes out to g5. Queen comes to c7. Knight bd2. Basically, white is settling for straightforward development here. Bishop b7 was played by black. c4. B takes c4, knight takes c4. And now the typical freeing thrust, which black has been building up to for some time. Pawn up to c5. At a stroke, getting rid of the weaknesses in black's pawn structure and freeing up his bishop on b7. White played rook c1. And now rook a c8, c takes c5, knight takes c5. Looks absolutely fine for black. So, you know, with the help of a logical build-up, black was able to nullify any threat posed by 6h3. Going back to c6, what is left? Well, we've seen many possibilities for white. Perhaps the one move I haven't mentioned is a favourite of Grandmaster Sergei Tiviakov. That's to say the move knight d2. Doesn't look especially frightening, but black still has to prove equality. The main idea of knight d2 is that when black challenges the front knight by knight d7, white's going to go knight df3 in this position. But in principle, any exchanges on e5 help black's cause, so I strongly recommend knight takes e5 in this position. And then if knight takes e5, bishop comes out to f5 with the usual formula in place. Bishop d3, well, bishop takes d3, knight takes d3, e6, castles, bishop d6, and you get the general idea. There was a gross Peter game which went on as follows. White tried queen to g4, black played queen to f6, white played bishop to d2, now rook d8. Quite a sharp move, with the intention that if white plays bishop g5 in this position, then black pins the bishop with queen to g6, so bishop g5 is perhaps not as good as it looks. Therefore, in the gross Peter game mentioned, white played rook a to d1, queen came to g6 anyway. Exchanges don't really help white's cause, so queen e2. Castles, rook fe1, queen f5. And black is basically not worse in this position. It's just a middle game where a couple of minor pieces have been exchanged and everything to play for. So going back to c6, I think what we can see from that small discussion is that white has a huge choice on move 5. I mean, we could be here all day analysing these moves. By and large, for the most part, he's going to develop that bishop on c1. So rejoining Del Rio Angelis now against Conquest. Let's see what happens when white plays bishop to d3. All right, and after that, black played the traditional move, knight d7. White played knight f3, so the same type of thing. And now Conquest played knight 7 to f6. So it's pretty clear that the next stage in development is to get the bishop on c8 into the game. Okay, white played h3. We've seen this mechanism before. The bishop on d3 prevents bishop f5, so white thinks he'd better stop bishop g4. And now it's up to black to try and find a way of developing that bishop. Now black plays an excellent move, knight b4. So taking full notice of the peculiarities of this position, Conquest comes out with a very good move. And I think this is the move which enables black to get a good game here. And what's white to do? Does he want to allow black to take on d3 in this position? I think not. Bishop c4 was played, and now finally black finds a home for his bishop, bishop f5. So that's a pretty good way to handle this bishop d3 variation. Well, of course, now white has to deal with the threat on c2. In the game, knight e5 was played. A very sharp move. Let's go back and see what would happen if white deals with the threat in a more regular manner. Obviously, knight a3 is most unattractive, so bishop b3 would be the move, would be my choice in this position, which attends to the threat with the least risk. I mean, I suppose he didn't play that move. He just simply didn't want to move that bishop again. I mean, you can see his point. He's moved it twice already. Now this is a third move with the bishop, but perhaps as the game went, this might have been a better move. After bishop b3, I think a5 is best, because it keeps up the threats. a3, knight back to d5, c4. I mean, this would be one way of trying to get the initiative from black. Well, knight b6. Castles, maybe a4. Bishop a2 and then e6. There doesn't seem to me to be too much wrong with black's position here. You know, he's got full development. Okay, the pawn on a4, well, that's reasonably easy to defend. And, well, let's see. Maybe knight c3 can be answered with knight e4. And black has quite a comfortable position here, I would say. So going back to the game, white's casting his eye around the position. And he tries knight e5. And then e6. Not, of course, knight takes c2 check, which would be a big mistake because of queen takes c2. Bishop takes c2, and then the cute move, bishop takes f7 checkmate. There was no way, of course, that Grandmaster Conquest was going to fall for that, so he comes out with e6. All right, well, now white has to attend to his pawn. He played the unattractive move, knight a3. Bishop comes out to d6. So it's really a question now of which knight is worse placed. Is the knight on a3 worse than the knight on b4? We'll just have to see. For me, the knight on a3 is more difficult to get into the game than the knight on b4, but there you go. So, white castles. Pawn up to h6, preventing bishop g5 and creating a retreat square for the bishop on f5, should white attack it. c3, knight b d5, and now white begins the process of reintroducing his knight into the game. Queen to c7, and now just counting the development tempi, what do we see? Well, black has developed all his minor pieces. White has castled, but my own view of this position is that it's about level. I mean, white does have a rock-solid central pawn formation. That would be the reason he would claim any sort of advantage in this position, but I don't believe it. I think black is fine here. Castling is coming up, rooks to the centre, a possible c5 in the wings. It's an easy plan, and well, Conquest manages to go through with that plan. Bishop d3. Question mark. Not sure why White played that move, other than he might have been lacking a little bit in confidence about his ability to beat Conquest here. I mean, to my eye, rook e1 seems to be the most logical, and now Black has a choice, really, which side to castle. Let's take a look at both those moves. If you're feeling aggressive, maybe castles long is a possibility. Of course, that's going to be risky, but is Black that much worse after Queen e2? I don't think so. I think White has nothing to shout about in this position. There's plenty of play here. According to your style, you might decide to castle short in this position. You know, this would appeal to more solid and timid souls among us. Nevertheless, after that, Queen e2, Rook a d8. Again, what is wrong with Black's position here? It's very difficult to say how such a position is going to go, because virtually all the play is the main play is to come. You can only say that both sides have been allowed to develop their pieces. Black's position out of the opening is quite reasonable. And finally, if you don't want to castle at all, there's also Rook d8. Again, there's nothing wrong with that move. Perhaps White might play Queen e2, castles transposes to the other variation, just taking play on one more move, Bishop b3, and now Black hits in the centre with c5. Again, does this look bad for Black to you? I don't think it does. I think Black is fine. So, well, perhaps Rook e1 should have been played. However, in the game, nobody's perfect. White plays Bishop d3. And Black play Bishop takes e5. D takes e5. Bishop takes d3. Queen takes d3. Queen takes e5. And I don't know whether this was a premeditated pawn sacrifice by White. I mean, Del Rio Angelis is 24.90. I don't know whether he thought he was going to catch Black's king in the middle after Rook e1, but it never quite turns out that way. So evidently White has to create the illusion that he's got compensation for the pawn here. So he starts to push Black around temporarily. Knight comes back to e7. Pawn to b3. Castles. And now Queen to f3. In such positions, you know, when you're a pawn down or you've blundered a pawn, you've still got to keep playing. You've got to pretend that the fact that you're a pawn down doesn't exist. You've got to try and play as though the position's normal. So White plays Queen f3, and at least now it's created a threat. The bishop takes h6. But this is easily parried. And Conquest decides to parry it by playing Knight d7. Sure, Black is going backwards, but it's hard to see any compensation in this position. Where are the weaknesses for White to aim at? I mean, there is a soft spot here at g7, but it's easily covered. All right, Bishop b2, hoping to get at g7, Knight g6, covering the soft spot. And now White plays a slightly peculiar looking move, pawn to g3. But evidently he was afraid of either Queen f4 or Knight f4. He just wants to cover that f4 square against any incursion from Black. I mean, just going back, what else could White try? Well, he could try the very crude move, Queen to c3. I think after that, centralisation will do for Black. e5 looks perfectly reasonable. And after Rook a d1, why not Rook a d8? Queen comes to g3, pinning the pawn. Well, again, Rook fe8. Just stick to the basics, get your pieces in the middle. I don't see any compensation for a pawn in this position. And, well, going back to Knight g6, what else is there? It's difficult to see in view of Black's idea of Queen f4 what White can do. Perhaps he can play Rook a d1, well then Rook a d8, and he's still got the same problem. So g3, it all looks rather slow. And Black centralises his rook. Okay, Queen c3, e5, h4. Perhaps that's another reason why White played pawn to g3 in the first place, making possible the idea of h4 and thereby annoying that knight on g6. But f6. Excellent move, putting a brick wall in front of that queen and bishop on the long diagonal. Queen e3. Again, thrashing round, attacking the unprotected targets. a6, safely defending those targets. Bishop a3, another random looking attack. And simply rook fe8. It's noticeable that whenever white attacks an unprotected black piece or a vulnerable black piece, black is always able to improve his position slightly. Certainly rook fe8, neither rook fe8 nor a6 look like any type of concession. So rook fe8 was played. Queen e4, another random looking attack, which black defends comfortably by knight df8. Bishop c5. Hang on, mistake. I put the wrong knight on f8. Excuse me. Slip of the mouse, I'm always doing that. Yeah, I wonder what was going on there. Sorry, knight df8, apologies. Bishop c5. Now we get normal service resumed. And after bishop c5, knight went to e6. Bishop e3, and now knight gf8. That was what was confusing me. Sorry, there were too many knight f8s on the score sheet. Okay, it doesn't affect too much in the position. White is still trying to find some targets in black's position to aim at. I mean, virtually the only thing I can see is he might have some possibility of taking h6. But there's no real reason why white should have any compensation for a pawn here. Again, he tries this random approach, threatening bishop takes h6. Again, black is able to parry the threat very comfortably with king to h8. Basically, white's a pawn down for nothing. Okay, so queen h5. Again, setting up some possibilities of bishop takes h6. King g8. You often see this in top-class games. This move, although it encourages white to think about repetition, because he goes queen to g4, there's no way that black is thinking about repeating the position here. He's just encouraging white to get into the wrong frame of mind. And now Conquest plays a very good move here, queen to f7. And the idea is if white takes on h6 in this position, shadoo. Black has f5, driving the queen away from the g-file, after which black wins material. So, back to the position after queen f7 now. And white played bishop to b6. Rook d2, proving that not only white can make aggressive moves in this position. Knight came to e3, hoping to get a grip on f5. And now another excellent move, h5. Queen comes to e4. As long as white can retain control over the light square f5, he can claim some sort of compensation in this position. As soon as black manages to wrest control of f5 from white, I think the game will be more or less over. Knight to d7. Bishop comes to a5. And now knight c5. And white essentially has been left with nothing to attack anymore. And black begins the cleaning up procedure, just shunting his pieces into good positions and then gradually realising the extra pawn. Okay, well, it mustn't be forgotten that rook on d2 is en prise, so rook comes to d3. It really is now a simple matter of technique. Queen g6. The square f5 falls into black's hands. b4, another sort of random looking attacking move. Knight e4. b5. A takes b5, c takes b5, and now knight to d4. And finally, black is paying white back for all those aggressive moves made earlier. This is now, I would say, a very easily winning position for black. Extra pawn, better centralisation. Not quite resignable, but almost. So, takes on c6, bishop comes back to b6, knight d2, king h1, and now another excellent move there, e4. Black would love to put that knight on f3. Queen comes to h3. Turns out white can't stop him, so the knight gets into an extremely good square. Rook e d1. Knight c e5. Another black knight comes to join the party. Queen f5. He's getting desperate, but the queen was maybe going to be throttled with knight to g4. Queen takes f5. Of course, black is very happy to exchange pieces. And then the knights continue to crawl all over white's position. Bishop c5. Rook e5. Very unpleasant fork. Knight e7 check. King f7. Bishop b4. And now black simply takes on e7. Bishop takes e7. King takes e7. Rook d to c1. And now another excellent move to finish off the game. Rook d2. That move could easily be overlooked. It's a nice touch, because if rook takes c4, rook takes f2, and white can't prevent mate. So it's a cute finish, really. So that was a very nice game by black. Evidently, the white player is somebody who thrives on inspiration. I think he had only one moment in that game when he could have played rationally and kept the position equal, and that was back here on move 14, where rook e1 would have been probably the most sensible approach. And failing to appreciate that cost him the point. 15 bishop d3 was either far too overambitious or just simply a mistake. But what are we to say about the opening? I mean, that's why we're here. Well, just going back, I hope I've shown ideas against all of the possible sixth move alternatives for white. I dare say there are even more than I've covered here, but certainly against bishop d3, the idea of knight d7 seems a good one. And then, well, obviously if white castles, you can go bishop g4, but if h3 as here, knight b4 seems perfectly respectable. So, summarising, let's go back to c6 now. Finish off. There's no doubt that for knight f3 has been the major challenge to the Alekhine for quite some time. Obviously d takes e5 and knight takes e5, c6 doesn't change that perception, but the onus is on white, definitely on white, to demonstrate some sort of an advantage against this interesting and new black system, devised and so well played by Tony Miles. The themes for black are easy to understand, I think. You challenge that knight on e5 as quickly as possible with knight d7, and they're relatively easy to implement. So enjoy this system for black whilst you can.
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.